First of all, an Angular application is a tree of components starting from app component and the list of child components that you build all the way down. So if you look visually, your application will appear as a tree of components starting from app component as a root. Behind the scenes, Angular uses a low-level layer called view, which holds a reference to your associated component class. Your component class basically encapsulates these views, so anything on these views like DOM updates are updated regularly. And each view state, which plays a major role in deciding whether to execute a change detection for that view and all of its child components or not at all. Okay, so one thing to understand is Angular is a reactive system and change detection is at the heart of its core. So the next big question is, how does Angular compiler detect those changes? So Angular compiler runs change detection with the view. It goes over all the bindings, which in our case input properties, and next it begins evaluating these expressions like comparing it with the previous value. So if you look at the view, it has a property called old values. So it matches the old value with the new one, new updated one. So if those didn't change, it'll just update. I mean, it will skip, otherwise it'll update. So Angular does a dirty checking on all your bindings. Okay. Finally, after the comparison, if the changes are detected, it finally updates the DOM. That's the basic mechanism of change detection in Angular. So now basically, application state can be triggered by three things. One is the timers by using set timeout or set interval, and XHR by fetching a data from an API service, and events such as clicks or submits or mouse change and things like that. Okay, so let's walk through a use case scenario here. So I mean, there's pretty much plenty of tutorials and videos out there about the change detection, which talks about counting and counters and things like that, to-do list, things like that. But I want to do things differently. I'm going to show you an application which is just the 10% of the real world application. To say a customer representative is going to order a drug for a patient. So let's put it that way. So when the customer, the CSR, let's say CSR as customer service rep, pulls out patient information, and that patient has, these are the available drugs, and these drugs can be added to his orders, and CSR can confirm order, and that will go to the shipping and it will be posted to the users, to the patient's address. Let's focus only on these four components. One component is the patient component, and the rest of the three component is the patient is the info component. It's over here, drug component, and the order component. So the info component deals with the patient information, and the available drugs deals with the list of available drugs that you may have got from an API that we will look shortly, and the order component, which lists all the drugs that you have added so far. When you are going to talk about objects, right, in the real world, the objects pretty much looks like this. It's huge, in the real world, in the real application that you will be working, in a large application especially, the data set and the objects or the payload, it will look something like this. It's kind of, if you ask me, this is actually small. Usually it'll be large. It's quite large. It'll have sub objects, and then it'll have sub properties, and then it'll have more properties deep linked. So when you're going to deal with such things, like, so when you get the data from an API and put it in your variable or a field in a class, right, there will be loads of manipulations going in that variable. Okay, so after looking at this, let's go into that variable that we are going to talk about. And if you focus on the model, first thing I want to show you the model of our. So the model is pretty much a patient detail, and it has all the usual things like the ID of a patient, name, phone, gender, and even the array of available drugs and ordered drugs. And the available drugs is obviously extended up to an interface called drug, and it does have the usual things like the name, strength refills, comments, and in the HTML, right, I am calling three components. I've talked about this earlier, which is the info component, drug, and order. So patient component is our parent. I'm gonna close this one, and these three are child, right? So the change direction is going haywire on all these three components. In the component class TS, right, we have this main patient detail record. Okay, so I'm just simulating an API call wherein I'm getting a data from an API. It's just an assumption, right? In the real world, it will be a subscribe, and then you'll be getting it from the data from the API, and you'll be assigning it here. I'm just doing a hardcore. As I told you, it's just a 10% of the real world app. So using some fake ID, I'm just generating a fake ID for that patient, and then for that, I'm just attaching a detail for that. The data to the patient detail. And later on, we have only part of the information from this API. And what about the available drugs? So again, in some other API call, I am doing another API call to fetch the drug details. Here, I'm just doing a fake, adding up the fake drugs to the patient detail like this. Okay, so nothing fancy here, no API calls, just a simulation. So we are just setting the patient details all together and going to splash it. It's going to display it across all these three components because all these three components are using that object, that patient detail object. Okay, so let's not get confused. You might ask, why can't we split the object into info as a separate object, available drugs as a separate array? You may ask that, but there is a very good reason. In any project that you work, you may not have the flexibility or freedom to choose what you like, because there may be a requirement to use the same object throughout the flow. Okay, so that's why I took this up, and then I wanted to explain, because that's how the real world development looks like. Okay, so pretty much straightforward. The patient details have we are binding. So we are binding the patient detail object to a patient detail input for all the three components, and only in one component we are emitting the information. Okay, so we are emitting an add drug event. We'll come back to that later. So first thing first, go to the info component. Info component is pretty much straightforward. Like, we're going to show only the patient details and things, and I have a change director count in here. And then in the component TS, right, my change direction is on OnPush. I'm going to change it to default for now. Okay, so you might have seen a momentary delay on the available drugs. That's because in the real world, the patient info is pulled first from an API, and later on there might be a slight delay in the API call for available drugs. So that is why I made it such a way, like having a slight delay. Okay, yeah, we have everything set. Now in the info component, whatever, like we don't have anything complicated over here, but in the actual application there might be. So patient detail input is here, and we are just we're rendering all the information over here. And the change detection component, if you see, the change detection ran like 5 times. It was evaluating unnecessarily because nothing is changed here, but it was just going unwantedly. We don't want that. And to top it off, right, if you're going to click the add action, so this will add to the order, to the final order over here. Now the problem is, when I do an add operation in another component, I am getting a change detection on the info component, which I really don't need. Okay, so this is where the real problem is. Now the Angular is going from top to bottom, so top to the child node levels, and activating the change detection. So this is where the problem is. Now, since this is a small set of data, we don't have to worry about much. But what if you have like tens and thousands of drugs listed here? I mean, do you want this to go like do like 6 or 7 times or 10 times rendering? Absolutely not. Okay, so that's what we're going to look into. The change direction count is set to 5. So when I'm going to do modify, when I'm going to modify in the final order, modify can be anything, like it might pop up a dialog box and wherein you will type in the prescription like what the doctors have said, or you might have an alternate medicine, alternate prescription for this medicine if it is not available, or I don't know, like some sort of instruction for the patient. Okay, let's assume that way. I didn't created anything elaborately here, just a modification, and it adds a comment. So when you modify it, let's assume that it opens a pop-up and then you're doing some comment. Instead, I'm just adding it directly into the model. Okay, so the model is we have seen already, which does have a comment on that. So when I modify, I'm triggering a change in the drugs component, which is way too wrong. It shouldn't happen. We don't want that, because there will be like thousands of record in this component. I don't want these records to get triggered every change detection. So this is where the change detection strategy comes in. So change detection strategy has two types, okay, which is OnPush and default. So to get the change detection strategy in your component, all you need to do is just define the property for change detection and then type in the enum for a change detection strategy. So when you do this OnPush thing, right? So OnPush enum, and when you're going to operate on available drugs component, see your info component, it's not detected. So this change event is not happen, but the information about this drug, right? It will be present in this variable over here. It will be present. To demonstrate that, let me just console. Okay, so this is from the info component. So basically we are modifying the patient detail, and when you do, let me clear this up, when you do add in our info component, this information changed, and in the ordered drugs you have an item. So you have the latest information in your object, but the change direction didn't perform here, hence you're not getting reflected, you're not getting the updated information rendered on this screen. The essence of it is, the more the OnPush strategy we have in our application, Angular runs less digest cycle. You might add things, already we have run like 7 or 8 times the change detection, but this is not run because we have told like we don't need to update here, because we don't there is no information from this we are going to showcase. But if there is anything that needs to get updated through some other component, we may have to manually trigger them, okay, when there is an OnPush. And finally, the OnPush, when you talk about the OnPush, we need to talk about the mutability and immutability. So what is a mutable and what is immutable? So for that, I think we need to come across this section of the code. So when you're altering, when you're changing something in your object or an array, okay, in this case we are changing something in our patient detail, we are mutating our array. So this available drugs is getting mutated, and even the patient details gets mutated. So it is getting mutated, and OnPush will not work. It will not detect any changes in the value. Okay, it detects changes only if the reference of the patient detail is changed. Okay, so there are two things when you want a more performance application. You need to think of two things. Okay, one is your object reference and the other one is the value. So here your value is changed. When it is a default change detection strategy, even if your value is changed, this gets triggered. Okay, it doesn't matter whether the value is changed or not, the change detection still keeps running. But in the OnPush strategy, it looks for the reference. It just on a higher level, it looks for it, and then nothing has changed, so we don't need to render the display to the view part. How to trigger the change detection if you change something in the available drugs? There are loads of things you can do, but the most easiest thing is changing the reference itself. So in here, we are trying to clone the patient details and then we are getting not only the value but also the reference. We'll be getting the new reference. We are assigning a new information to the patient detail. So let's look at the updated change. Now we are in OnPush. Our info component is at OnPush. Okay, I think it should be done here. Let's cancel that out. We'll go over here and then, so add drug is this part, okay? And when I add, you can take a look at it, okay? So the change detection keeps running because the reference of the patient detail is changed. Okay, so this is pretty much about the OnPush strategy, but OnPush is very, very important. So we changed OnPush for the drugs component, and you didn't see any update happen here, okay? So that's because in our generate fake drugs, we are calling an API, and then we are just mutating, but we are not actually changing the reference of the reference of the drugs, right? So reference of the patient details. So we need to change the reference, or if I change the reference, two things happen here. So patient details equals object assign right. Immediately we can see a problem here. So once this drugs are successfully generated, it'll go here, because it'll go here and trigger the change direction for patient info, which we don't want. So there is some unnecessary action happening here, okay? To avoid that, we can just keep it aside, okay? And we can manually trigger the change detection for this component once the value is available. For that, let's go back to the drug component. In here, I've created a change detection ref. With the help of change detection ref, we can achieve that. So with the change detection ref, we can draw a method called update, and this method will manually trigger the change detection even though OnPush strategy is set. So how to do that? How do we incorporate this component's information in the parent component? Okay, in the parent component, we can create a vChild with the drug component, and using this drug component, right, we can straight away go to the API call, which is the fake API call, and then once we get all the data, we can use the drug component dot update. So this will update only this particular set. Okay, so this will be untouched. So same way, we can disable by simply calling the detach method, and enable by using the detect changes. So we do have something called cd-ref dot detach, and you have a couple more things like mark for check, things like that. Okay. So using detach, you can remove them from the change detection. Pretty much we saw about the change detection strategy and how we can leverage it to control the change detection in these components, right? So before closing this, we need to focus on one more thing. Like in the core.js, sorry, there is this thing called check and update view. So this method is responsible for all the change detection things that are happening. If you have any performance issues, right, you can just set a breakpoint here and then monitor what's happening in your application. But however, setting a breakpoint on a large application and then cycling through each and every debug information will be cumbersome. So the best thing is, having an OnPush on your component and leave it as such. So this is one thing I like to share. And then now in conclusion, right, Angular change detection is similar to Angular JS, like comparing the template expressions, but there is a big difference. Like change detection doesn't work as continuous loop. It is not a loop that is running like in Angular JS. Okay, in Angular JS, this runs as a loop, which we call it as a digest cycle. A change detection is something like listening to an event. So all the event, Angular overrides all the event listener from the low-level API of JavaScript. It just listens to it and then it triggers the change detection. So you can take it that way. Comparing to Angular JS, right? change detection mechanism is customizable in Angular because we have seen that we can just disable change detection for a component using OnPush. I may not have covered all aspects of change detection, but if you feel you need more, please comment on this video. In most cases, as a developer, we should not worry about the default setting of your change detection strategy, but we must keep in mind that if your application is going to handle plenty of data objects and its different dependencies across components. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and please subscribe and see you soon in another video.